Okay, guys, we're going to talk about the siege of Leningrad. Okay, so what happens is the German army advanced deep into Soviet Russia. And by mid-July, the Army Group North had made 500 miles in 3 weeks. Its target was Leningrad, the beautiful historical city now called St. Petersburg. Hitler declared that the city would fall like a leaf. By early September, Leningrad's 3 million inhabitants were surrounded, and occupation seemed only days away. Okay, so they've surrounded the city of Leningrad in Russia. The Germans have surrounded it. All right, so if you look back at our map, which I think, did they have one? Oh, I thought we had one. Well, yeah, I mean, this is a world map here. So it's over here in Russia, and the Germans have surrounded Leningrad, okay? And so as the Germans approached, Leningrad prepared to fight. Over 100 miles of anti-tank ditches were built and buildings were booby-trapped. But just as the Nazis reached the gates of the city, there was a sudden change of plan. Many of the troops were sent south to take part in an assault on Moscow. So instead of a full-scale attack on Leningrad, it was decided to starve and bombard the city into submission. Its population swollen by refugees fleeing the Nazi advance, Leningrad needed huge amounts of food each day, but the only routes left into the city were a small airstrip and a ferry via Lake Ladoga to the east. As winter arrived, the amount of food getting in was barely half what was needed, and worse was to come. By November, the besieged citizens were living on starvation rations. In desperation, people ate horses, cats, dogs, rodents, even grass. The only water supply was from the Neva, which ran through the city. Some even turned to cannibalism. It was said that people were afraid to leave their homes in case they were killed and eaten. In the midst of all this suffering, there was also constant artillery and aerial bombardment. The streets were littered with dead bodies, killed by the bombs or from starvation. By winter, it wasn't possible to bury them as the ground had frozen solid. But the winter freeze brought good news too. Lake Ladoga froze so solid it was possible to drive heavy supply trucks over it. By January of 1942, okay, so we're at like 400 trucks a day were coming into the city, taking out refugees on their return journey. The trucks often came under heavy fire or crashed into craters and holes in the ice, but they saved the city from starvation. In spring, the thaw cut off the truck supply route across the lake, although food continued to come in by boat. But the warmer weather brought further misery. As frozen corpses thawed and began to rot, an epidemic swept through the city with disease, killing thousands. But the worst was over. As the ground softened, the bodies were swiftly buried, and a pipeline laid under the lake began to deliver fuel. Leningrad could sense it was winning and celebrated with a concert in its Philharmonic Hall, performed by musicians recalled from the front. The music, which was the seventh Leningrad Symphony, was written especially by Dmitri Shostakovich, one of its most famous citizens. The concert was broadcast, and German soldiers who listened in became demoralized. So they heard it and were demoralized that they did not sound like it at all like a city on the brink of defeat. Okay, so that was the siege of Leningrad, and they survived that siege. Okay, so now we're gonna watch a video, a short overview. This is actually just something you can listen to about the siege and how the Soviet soldiers regained the city by the end of January 1942. And this is just something to listen to.
This is the Vanish holster. Don't need a belt with a Vanish.
Welcome to World War II Chronicles, a weekly tribute to America's fighting men and women in commemoration of the Second World War. These programs are narrated by Ed Herlihy and are based on the news broadcasts of the war period from the recorded sound collection of the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
Since September 1941, Leningrad had been under siege. Slowly, the city's population of 3 million was starving to death. Food rations were cut to less than a third of the amount normally needed by adults. As the siege continued, the death toll mounted. Tens of thousands died each month. The cold winter intensified the suffering. With the disappearance of oil and coal, there was no heat or water supply. By the following year, however, the Soviets were turning the tide of the war, and a counteroffensive was launched to relieve Leningrad.
Stockholm reports that the Russians have launched a full-scale offensive in the Leningrad area that the offensive began last Wednesday with a terrific bombardment of German-held Shushelborg, and that Marshal Timoshenko is in command of the Russian forces.
On January 12th, more than 4,500 guns opened up on the Germans. The roar of Soviet rocket launchers shook the earth. Soviet troops, isolated in Leningrad, pushed their way towards the main Soviet line. On the 18th, the two groups were linked. The Red Army had made a breach wide and deep enough to save the city.
The siege of Leningrad has been broken. The city that for the past 15 months has stood up against the best and the worst that Hitler's high command could devise in death and destruction has shaken itself free. Leningrad has been the symbol of Russian resistance since the city dug itself in behind the German encirclement a year ago last September.
German troops still sat on Leningrad's doorstep, but the Russian supply corridor was now open for good, though it would not be until January of 1944 that the German invaders were finally gone. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which had been written during the siege, was performed by the Leningrad Philharmonic to celebrate the city's liberation. I'm Ed Hurley. Join me next time for World War II Chronicles.
So then they actually have some footage of the siege here.
Inside Leningrad, food supplies to the besieged city had been diminishing throughout the autumn. By late November, they were at their lowest ebb for the entire duration of the siege. Manual workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became inevitable. As winter arrived and temperatures fell to the -20s, thousands began to die each day. Total starvation threatened constantly. To the Germans, collapse seemed imminent.
Okay,